Welcome to this whānau. Tūturu is a space to hold robust and enlightening discourse, an in-depth, unapologetic and unforgiving whānau, bringing together experts. Very rarely do we get the opportunity to have a proper whānau about colonisation.
Indigenous critical thinking is by definition about the collective. How is this going to impact on te taiao? How is this going to impact mai mokopuna? How does this impact our whānau, our hapū, our iwi? How does it impact on all of those things that are essential to our collective well-being?
Our kaupapa today e Wāma is Indigenous critical thinking. Strap in, because we have a lot to get through, but we have an awesome balance of new ideas and ancient wisdom. We're very privileged to have joining us today on our wānanga Tohunga Mark Kopua and his beautiful wife and psychiatrist, Dr. Diana Kopua, Māori researcher Tina Ngata, and Māori professor Mera Penehira. Indigenous critical thinking is a flash term, but not a foreign concept. Join me as we explore what this means and how we might apply this way of thinking in our everyday lives.
Indigenous critical thinking, it's not anything new to us. It's perhaps a new term, but it's the way our ancestors have thought and have taught us mai rānō. It's particularly Indigenous because it relates to our whakapapa, it relates to te taiao, it relates to a Māori way of thinking for Māori, iwi takitaki rānei. I think quite simply it's about being careful in terms of how we think and what we do with that thought, and it's being brave to think through things in a strategic way in order to come to a judgment or an agreement or a decision about something that we've heard, seen, felt or experienced. It's a whole lot of things, but those are the first ones that come to me.
Yeah, and particularly when we use the term Indigenous, we're not just talking about Māori critical thinking, and that lends itself to, of course, because we're here in Aotearoa, you know, Indigenous critical thinking is Māori critical thinking, but also when we use that word Indigenous, it invokes a relationship to other peoples who have had similar experiences to us, other Indigenous peoples, our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And of course, they too have experienced colonisation. So I think at least one aspect of it, in addition to how our tūpuna thought in their time, is also having a deliberately anti-colonial perspective and lens on what it is, because colonialism has infiltrated our knowledge systems, has infiltrated our thought patterns. It's through the doctrine of discovery, it didn't just stop at taking land. In order to justify taking land, you know, our mentality had to shift in order to even give it away and to think that these things were good for us. So that required them to infiltrate our knowledge and our thinking systems. So Indigenous critical thinking is obviously, you know, thinking of our tūpuna ways of making sense of the world, and also it's a deliberately anti-colonial way of thinking that considers the role of colonisation in impacting our thought processes and impacting our perspectives so that we can start to dismantle some of those impacts.
It reminds me of the story, and I think our first story of a disruption was the separation of rangi and papa, and quite often at kura you're taught quite a simplistic way of understanding the separation story, but it started with it being common. It was as the status quo for rangi and papa to be in that embrace and all the children within, and then something happened. Something wasn't right. It was challenged, it was questioned. And for me, to go back to our pūrākau allows us to really stay in this Indigenous way of knowing that came from our tūpuna, so that when we are talking, we're using examples mai rānō, because we're at risk of that colonial construct of how to think.
Yeah.
And so using pūrākau can be really useful. And there's an atua uepoto, and we often talk about uepoto when Kekerewai had enough, didn't like the restriction, noho tatapua te Kekerewai. And so uepoto searched for the hinatore. And so this healthy level of doubt has been around since the beginning of our story.
It's in the pūrākau, it formed these two different houses of thought that would debate and argue backwards and forwards with each other. And one was the house of the tuakana called Tūtea Niwaniwa, and the other one was the house of the taina called Huaki Pauri. And so there, right at the beginning of our whakapapa, are these two opposing ways of thinking that will go backwards and forwards with each other and practice critical indigenous ways of thinking and debating, pulling things apart, putting it back together.
I think that's a really important framework to remember. Tūtea niwa, fixed, stuck thinking, Huaki Pauri, being able to open and critique, the house of Indigenous critical thinking. Because, you know, things have to be common and they work, right? You do them and you live life like that. But when they're not working, are you able to critique, review, reflect, and shift because it's not working for everyone anymore? And so even being able to say, you know, which house are you coming from? Tūtea niwa or Huaki Pauri, because there's some really valid reasons to stay in Tūtea niwa in some instances.
Yeah.
And of course, whiro, because sometimes people think whiro is a negative energy atua, but whiro is like the sixth born of Rangi and Papa and represents the sacred realm, the protector of the sacred realm. And you do have to, you know, put your guard up and stand your ground on some positions. But when you're stuck and it's impacting your relationships with others, that's when you really need to be having a look at shifting into Huaki Pauri.
What I understand from this is that when we're talking about critical thinking, it's about understanding our emotions enough to take a step back and understand where these emotions, thoughts, or reactions might come from, and processing them appropriately. It's about applying our knowledge of mātauranga Māori to these situations, to reach a place of understanding. Māori have examples of ways to deal with this, such as haka, toi Māori, and tangianga, to ensure that these emotions don't take charge of our actions.
The real gift of Indigenous critical thinking and Māori critical thinking is that it's not telling you what to think, it's giving you tools to make sense of the universe around you as it presents itself to you. So it's tools for how to think, not telling people what to think. And it's so important now because of the amount of information that's flying at us, that's in our hands, that's on the screens, and it's, you know, I think I saw at one point that in, I think it was 1987, we were all exposed to like 40 newspapers worth of information a day. And there was either a newspaper that you read in addition to the news you might watch at night time, in addition to information on billboards that you might drive by, in addition to stuff you might hear as well. And then that, and now, because of the internet, social media, and phones having information at our fingertips, it's now every person is exposed to 5,000 newspapers worth of information a day. And, you know, the question is, have we adapted how we deal with that information? And how much of that information is colonised and colonising information?
When you think about colonisation and the fact that when the colonisers came into Aotearoa, they came with their common sense, their idea of what was status quo, and they built empires based on their common sense. And without critical thinking, we've just accepted them, or not accepted them, but not realised that whether we accept what's in the institutions or not, we're in it, we're part of it. And for the education systems who are loaded with teachers who have knowledge banking knowledge into the student. You must know this information in order to be successful. And if you're not, there must be something wrong with your thinking. And then there's this pipeline to mental health services, who's another empire of common sense that does not like to be challenged and critiqued. And so the distress and whatever is going on for the child and how they're thinking or not achieving is screwed over again with the tools of the oppressor in the first place.
Yeah.
And so the notion of Indigenous critical thinking is in fact a resistance to that idea of common sense. It's resisting further colonisation. It's very much, as you've alluded to, Tina, it's very much about understanding the political context, the socio-political context, and pushing back against that common sense, against those political forces that have oppressed us. And discovering in that the pipelines that critical thinking give us. The pipeline to kura, kaupapa Māori, the pipeline to whare wānanga, the pipeline to our Indigenous knowledges. The
Pipeline to liberation. The pipeline to liberation that comes from challenging that. Like I can't, and this is one of the things that I've loved about our, working with you, especially Papa Mark and Di, is that you can't overstate the impact upon a people that comes from turning their world upside down, their understanding of the universe and their place in it. The impacts are intergenerational, they're huge, and we see a lot of those impacts playing out today. And it's often overlooked. I think it's one of those things that either people take as a given or whatever, but we don't talk about it as much as we could, the role that it's had on our knowledge systems.
The impact that it has is turning their life upside down, because the way they thought, what they believed, for Christians that are coming into the wānanga, their religion and their faith, everything just turns into chaos. It turns into absolute chaos. And that in itself is part of the colonial project of Descartes' I think, therefore I am. So if what I thought isn't now, then what am I?
And alternatively, and they've been upside down the whole time.
Yes.
And so this knowledge and this critical thought gives them the opportunity to stand up straight again. That's the exciting part.
As our guest mentioned, the way we think is a result of colonisation. Our ways of thinking have completely shifted, and although our ability to think critically with an Indigenous lens is not gone, for many of us it's difficult to do. Likewise, a lot of the work that needs to be done to get to a point where we can understand critical thinking is a very hard and confronting journey. A journey of understanding why you are the way that you are and why you think the way that you do. Because until you realise that, your thoughts are set in stone from the way that you were raised.
I talk about in our wānanga Ken Robinson's YouTube clip about divergent thinking, and a study that was done that showed that a young group of people pre-kindergarten were more, that's our babies, more divergent in their thinking, and as they get older and go through the education system, their ability to think divergently is reduced, right? And that's our curriculum that reduces that. And yet I do believe that our rangatahi, they can smell our adult hypocrisy and our contradictions and our lack of divergent thinking and lack of creative spaces that we hold so that there can be wānanga and disagreement rather than order and control. And that's, I was saying that earlier, and reminds me of you telling me a story about how there was a 2-year-old who was a rangatira of a tribe, which is like, would not be considered today, but was a big part of how we existed before.
Yeah, our people were, in that particular story there, they were celebrating the birthday of a 2-year-old because the 2-year-old was their ariki. And for the person who shared that story, who was a white minister of the church, it was an oddity for him to to have to be in a space where everything is hinged on this 2-year-old baby. And of course, he'd just come out from England, so that was the complete opposite to coming to what the culture that he grew up in himself. And there were a number of things that he documented that were back to front. And like one of those things that he did document was that he also got invited to a runanga hui, which is different to the runanga hui that we have now. And when he got there, he noticed that there were children present. And not only that, but the children were asking valid questions in an adult manner, and that they were responded to by their parents and their grandparents as if they were adults. They weren't responded to, or their questions were treated with maturity. And so this also was a strange thing for this minister to experience, that I think he likened it to being as part of Westminster Abbey or something like that. And so it was odd for him, that whole culture change.
I love these kōrero because, and the pūrākau, because it completely flies in the face of what the coloniser will tell us, that we didn't have those systems of arriving to a conclusion, you know.
So the concept of colonisation has this universality that says that doesn't matter about the context, rationality is rationality full stop. And it's like, well, actually, not in our tāne te wānanga story. Knowledge isn't something you acquire. Knowledge is a process. There's a spiritual aspect of it, the intangible aspect of it, and that's not rational in science. And although science is helpful, it's only part of what our understanding of knowledge is.
And it's rational in terms of Māori science. It's just not rational in terms of Western science.
I spoke earlier about how the way that we've been brought up and the world around us can influence our view of the world. Even if we think that we see things through a Māori lens, that Māori lens could be shaped by Western ways. It's challenging to come to grips with this when your whole life has been surrounded by te ao Māori.
The pushback on decolonisation that happened relatively recently, in recent years, where there was a recognition that decolonisation, in some words or some approaches, centres the coloniser, and people didn't want to centre colonisation anymore. They wanted to centre themselves, and so the natural response to that was to engage in re-indigenization. And so then the push became about, well, it's all about re-indigenizing. And we don't even need to talk about colonisation because that centres the coloniser. But the two actually need to work in tandem. Yes, we do need to engage in re-indigenization, but when you engage in re-indigenization in the absence of anti-colonialism, you miss the point that colonialism has become very sophisticated at hiding in plain sight. And it's replete throughout our worlds as well. And so, you know, I think that having an anti-colonial lens also helps you to direct your re-indigenizing energy appropriately in ways that are strategic and efficient. Otherwise, you can wind up just spending all of your energy everywhere and not sure where it's sitting. So having the deliberate anti-colonial lens that looks at the process of colonisation, exposes the criminality of it, understands its mechanisms and how it's worked, helps us to re-indigenize more efficiently.
This point from Tina is important. It's no one's fault that our Pakeke chose to embrace te ao Māori and flood our minds with all the positive things about te ao Māori like kura kaupapa, kohangareo, language revitalisation and kapahaka, instead of focusing on the impacts of what colonisation has done to us. They probably just wanted to protect us. But once again, can we truly look at anything critically without understanding the context of everything that has happened to us?
Although we talk about or question what Indigenous critical thinking is, there's also, I won't call it symptoms because it's a great thing, it's not an illness to have critical thinking abilities, right? But there is an impact as though it's a bully, it's dangerous, it's risky to even behave with critical thought inside those institutions where a way of being is not to be debated. And so the impact is huge. It ostracises Māori leaders. It ostracises anyone that wants to question. It doesn't matter whether you're yelling or whispering, whether your tone is soft. The impact is though you've just reached across and punched the doctor in the face. Right?
Because the greatest value of, or where critical thinking is most powerful, is most effective, is when there is a safe place, when there are relationships that you feel safe to debate in. When we don't fear having our thought questioned, where we understand that's a great thing because I can challenge myself to think differently or not. I can reaffirm where I'm thinking now. So I think, the power of critical thinking is in the relationships of trust, and knowing, as we've all mentioned now, knowing that debating, that questioning, that inquiry is absolutely healthy. We never would have arrived here had we not done that.
Relationship is everything. We want to hold this relationship and recognise that we might get uncomfortable, and when we are critiquing each other's behaviour or thoughts or opinions or assumptions, it gets uncomfortable and you start getting worried about, oh no, are we going to be able to hold on to this relationship and carry on with it in this uncomfortable space? That's our goal. And so we've just continuously tried to create that space. It doesn't always work.
Māori are notorious for getting hurt feelings about opposing whakaaro. This is probably a byproduct of colonisation and our need to hold on to and protect anything and everything that we have. But if we create a space around the people we care about, who can tell us what we need to hear as opposed to what we want to hear, that's when we can start thinking broader about certain things. Also important to note, it's not just about having something to say for the sake of it.
You know, over the years I've looked at different pūrākau and different whakapapa, and looking at just the children of Rangi and Papa, how it shows the unfolding of the creation of this whole environment and the world that we live in. And yet I've seen over the last few years different whakapapa tables that have been, in my opinion, grossly tampered with, because they've shoved Tāne, who's right down the bottom end of all this, at the top end of all that. And so that starts me thinking about how much does the Christian influence have over that in terms of wanting to pour more focus on the human-centric existence as opposed to focusing on the taiao, which is basically what all those other 60-something odd tūpuna are about the taiao. And then you get the tāne down the bottom end like that. And even after tāne, which is Moko, is still the taiao, but then you get the tāne who's sort of really influential in the creation of mankind, but then all of a sudden in this tempered whakapapa is right at the beginning end of all that. So it makes me, you know, that starts this whole critical way of thinking. It's like, well, how did that happen? And even to the point of seeing a growing up understanding that the origins of the world started with Rangi and Papa, and then the fascination of actually seeing my name at the bottom of a chart and thinking, wow, this is not humbug. This is actual, for me and my people, fact. And so that was what that kōrero was making me think about, how much colonisation has had in influencing and tampering and tainting the waters of our mātauranga and the way we understand the world that we are part of.
You have the great chain of being, eh? And the order of the universe was God, old man with a big beard sitting on his throne with cherubs on his lap, up in the clouds, and the archangels, and then the angels, and then the Pope and the Pope's representatives, and then the monarchs of Europe, and then the aristocracy, and then the commoners, and then two-legged mammals, then four-legged mammals, and then sea creatures, fish and birds, and then shellfish because they couldn't move as much, and then trees, and then demons. And Indigenous peoples have featured sometimes in the realm of demons, and the furthest up that scale that we've featured was two-legged animals. And that was the nature of the universe, and that didn't even go away when the Enlightenment period came along. So you can certainly, it's understandable that when you see a whakapapa that starts to put humans above taiao, that it's reminiscent of this great chain of being idea that has still, you know, that great chain of being, that became the basis of modern taxonomy. How we categorise the natural world around us still assumes that we're in this position of dominating the taiao as opposed to the taiao not just being the tuakana, but also being the source of all of our tikanga and our wānanga and our knowledge systems as well.
Funny, because it's making me think about critical thinking and so forth, as which lens are you going to look through at certain things. It was making me remember a karakia that our tūpuna had, that was a karakia that was used to go and get a tree so that they can turn this tree into a house or turn this tree into a waka or some whatever resource that humans needed to do. But in this karakia, what it does is that it acknowledges that that tonga that they're going to take from the forest is already a house, it's already a pātaka, it's already a parent, and it's already a waka for the critters and the creatures that live in the forest and where. So it flips the whole lens and adds another dimension to how we think about the taiao, where we fit into it, how we should fit into it, and of course overall kind of like acknowledge that you know, that the taiao is one of those lenses that we should be looking through to think more critical about the world that we exist in.
The Age of Enlightenment reminds me of the time, particularly as a psychiatrist, the time that I, the me by myself, I as an individual, it became prominent, and so the collective wasn't as important as me and my autonomy over me, while still having to follow the rules and order of society, which is a bit of a contradiction. But what I know about that is that the I had thoughts and feelings, and if we weren't keeping up in this colonised world, then there must be something wrong with us. And then what was wrong with you could be commodified. You're in distress, I have something for you. And then there's competition about who's got what for them so that we can fix them. And when I think about critical thinking from an Indigenous perspective, for individuals who are disconnected from their whānau, their hapū, their iwi, from life, it must be collective. And individuality and individualism has done nothing but made our processes invisible. And so when people of authority and privileged positions are helping you or teaching you or controlling you because it's best for you, their processes are usually invisible. And so they might think that they're actively reflecting, but the moment you ask them to be in the collective, they can't do it. And it must be conditions where the collective can critique your opinions, because your opinions, unchallenged, are going to be cemented into being your beliefs. And that's the danger of colonisation, and for us as colonised people, that if we don't challenge our assumptions, then they're going to be ingrained beliefs that we transfer onto the next generation and the next generation, and they're going to think that's a Māori way of thinking and knowing and being.
I think you're absolutely right that Indigenous critical thinking is by definition about the collective. So if we think about when I'm critically thinking, what's my framework? And it's how is this going to impact on te taiao? How is this going to impact my mokopuna? How does this impact our whānau, our hapū, our iwi? How does it impact on all of those things that are essential to our collective well-being? It's nothing new. It is definitely, in my view, critical thinking is about critically remembering. It's remembering the critical ways of thinking prior to colonisation, and we have that in our memory. We have that in our DNA. And as you were talking before, Tina, about people perhaps not being conscious to their critical thinking, but being conscious to a feeling. And that to me is part of Indigenous critical thinking.
Yes.
It's
sensing.
It is that we feel it. We don't just think it up here, but we think and we feel it in our puku and in other parts of our tinana. And it's really important, I believe, in working with people and helping people develop those critical thinking skills by remembering. I think that's a really important one.
There was this huge debate and discussion that was turning a little bit nasty too at certain stages over an issue to do with moko. And I understand that, you know, people are looking for somebody to give some sort of direction or opinion about moko issues and so forth. And I was staying back out of it because I was really, really enjoying some of the positive discussion that was going on, and trying to stay out of it too, because I know that there's this tendency, even though they want me to jump in there and be part of it, what tends to happen is that as soon as I jumped in, it just negated, it just stops. And so the idea for me was to stay out of that so that the conversation would keep rolling, and whether it went nasty or it stayed on a positive note was up to how people were critically thinking and discussing the issue. The other thing too that Tina has just raised about memory, because part of the thing is I was sharing before that I recall, being dragged around from one hui to another hui as a child, and staying overnight at the different marae with my mum, and debates would start after dinner, and they would sit and have these debates with one another, and it would either be about whakapapa or it would be about local history, you know, who actually did catch the biggest tuna in manga tuna and all those sorts of things. And as a child, it would bounce backwards and forwards in a full house. And, you drift off to sleep, and then at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, you wake up and they were still going. And so I realized later when we got to this idea of having a discussion about critical thinking, and I started to remember that this was a process that our tūpuna and our ancestors, those were all the kaumātua of that particular hapuri, and that they had these processes in place in order for them to debate certain issues that were important.
Absolutely. And that brings me comfort knowing that our tūpuna already did this. Truth be told, the wording Indigenous critical thinking is off-putting. It's a scary term, but my ancestors did it. They probably didn't have those fancy words to describe it. They probably just called it wānanga. We're going to veer off to a slightly different kaupapa now, which is hugely important once we start to understand what has happened to us. Once we understand colonization, it's so easy to get angry, to retaliate, or to target someone or something.
It's really important for us to not reverse that role of behaving to men, how men have behaved to women, behaving to Indigenous people as a coloniser has behaved. We have to be quite critical in not just our thinking, but reflecting how we want to be, our mokopuna to be in the environment with each other.
Or even behaving towards colonisers, how colonisers have behaved towards us. as well. It's a very natural instinct to want to, you know, turn the taiaha back on them.
That's right.
But that's also not necessarily going to be in the best interests or the well-being of the collective, or our mokopuna, or our taiao. Which is not to say that you should never hold them to account, but, you know, I think critical thinking, Indigenous critical thinking, enables us to be able to look at what's the system's impact, what's the system impact of the thing that I want to say or the thing that I want to do, what's the collective impact of that, and is that in all of our best interests?
Resistance and protest doesn't have to be about hikoi or occupation. Sometimes it may just look like, as Kingi Tuheitia has said, simply being Māori.
Those are some of the things that I've just discovered over the years, is that we've become afraid to talk about our atua Māori and our karakia tawhito and all those types of things. That what I have noticed in the modern day is how much people like Rangi Mātāmua and myself, when I'm sharing different pūrākau, is to be far more light-hearted about it, so that it becomes an approachable something that our people want to engage with. You know, that's creating the sense of safety, reinstating the sense of safety with dealing with such tapu things, so that, you know, you can facilitate a space for our people to get involved and to also develop their own critical thinking about some of those kōrero and the gems that lie in those pūrākau and karakia and so forth.
Making them accessible, making them accessible. And it wasn't that we just became afraid of these things, they were actually beaten out of us.
Yes.
We were, it was, you know, made illegal to practice these things. So, through Christianisation, through colonisation, that fear still exists for some people. But as we decolonise and de-Christianise and re-energise being Māori...
Decriminalise.
Yes, decriminalised, all of those things, we are making it more accessible, and we're giving ourselves a space to access those different tools for thinking.
You might be thinking, well, now what? What are we going to do with all of this kōrero? How can I be a critical thinker?
You know, in terms of how do we use critical thinking, to allow us to learn how to think about what we're thinking, like how are we thinking, not staying staunch in what we're thinking. Where did I learn that from? How come I'm so fixed on it? What would be the conditions that would make me consider someone else's perspective?
One of the gifts for me in learning about the doctrine of discovery is that it's helped me to see the colonialism in some of our systems much more clearly, especially our knowledge systems much more clearly. And one of those is the idea that a student is an empty vessel waiting to be filled. And then there's another person in domination, and they will be the one to fill them with that information. And that's so underserving. It just underserves, you know, both the tauira and the kaiako as well, because you're all missing out on that learning journey. So, and we do that as kaiako, but we also do that as parents. And even when I was a kaiako, my students used to go, oh, everything you say is why? Why? Anytime I have an idea, why do you think that way? Why do you think that way? Because I do have always believed that it's really important to take the learning journey alongside them and not tell them what to think, but understand where is their thinking coming from.
And I guess the question was asked, how do we apply critical Indigenous thinking in our lives? Where? When? And I think you gave a perfect example. We do it all the time. It's almost a natural part of every decision in our daily lives, or it can be. And that doesn't mean you're sitting there thinking really hard. No, you've just got this process that you almost automatically go into when you're considering something or reflecting on your work or reflecting on something someone's told you about your work or whatever. It's not something we choose to apply there or when I'm in wānanga, but it's part of naturally who we are.
E wama, that was the wānanga. To think critically about something is not to let your thoughts go unchallenged, just because that's the way you've always thought. How you think is a result of your surroundings. Consider other whakaaro, not as an attack, but as an alternative perspective. Think about how that may affect you, your taiao, your whānau, your collective. We were never self-centered people. We were community people. We always did what was best for our taiao and our whānau. Tēnā koutou.